You're now on the historic route. Today, the other Napoleon, the exploits of Bonaparte the Third, Part 2. We pick up our story 2 years after Napoleon the Third's escape. It is now 1848, and to call this year pivotal might be an almost criminal understatement, and not only pivotal for Napoleon the Third personally, but for France and Europe more general. You see, this is the year of revolutions. Now imagine the entirety of Europe like an intricate arrangement of dominoes, perfectly lined up in an orderly fashion, but needing only the slightest touch to, well, create a domino effect. And starting with France, exactly that happens. In 1848, one after the other, almost every European state erupts in revolution. The big, the small, the weak, the powerful, sparing none. So let's take a step back to understand why all this happens. Okay, let me give you some quick background information on what happened leading up until 1848, so that we can then get back to Napoleon the Third and France. Now first, we need to understand that Europe had seen sort of a new order arise after the fall of Napoleon the First. His, let's call it, propaganda of republicanism had swept old monarchical Europe. And this republicanism was seen by the ruling elite as a disease one cures the uneducated masses of. So when the first Napoleon was finally defeated for good, the Congress of Vienna, which consisted of all the heads of Europe, came together in 1815, where they decided to put the continent on a very strict recovery regimen to heal the populace of any remaining republican infection. Okay, so what does this mean in practice? Certain things such as will of the people, scrapped. Self-determination, scrapped. Nationalism, scrapped. Rights, such as free speech and freedom of the press, you guessed it, scrapped. And for more than 30 years, this system held liberalism and republicanism mostly in check. But this does not mean that the ideas and ideals of the French Revolution, and more broadly liberalism and republicanism, died off. Quite the opposite. I think of it this way. The heads of Europe kept sweeping their problems under a rug until the amount of problems under that rug became so numerous that the rug wasn't even touching the floor anymore. Grievances piled on grievances, and this actually worked up until 1848, that is. Up until it all came crashing down. Alexis de Tocqueville, of Democracy in America fame, someone who will feature again in this episode, said quite prophetically before the revolution that, "I am told that there is no danger because there are no riots. I am told that because there is no visible disorder on the surface of society, there is no revolution at hand. Gentlemen, permit me to say that I believe you are mistaken. True, there is no actual disorder, but it has entered deeply into men's minds. See what is preparing itself among the working classes, who, I grant, are at present quiet. No doubt they are not disturbed by political passions, properly so called, to the same extent that they have been. But can you not see that their passions, instead of political, have become social? Do you not see that they are gradually forming opinions and ideas that are destined not only to upset this or that law, ministry, or even form of government, but society itself, until it totters upon the foundations on which it rests today? This, gentlemen, is my profound conviction. I believe that we are at this moment sleeping on a volcano. I am profoundly convinced of it. So, in 1848, this volcano, these dominoes, this sweeping under the rug, it all came to a head. And starting with France, Europe's year of revolution had begun. The French king was toppled. The various Italian states were forced to become semi-constitutional or constitutional monarchies. Hungary, as well as all directly controlled Italian Habsburg lands, declared their independence from Austria, with the Austrian emperor fleeing and having to be replaced. The various German states had similar fates, and so almost all of Europe was engulfed in revolutionary flames. And what did we say in the first part of this episode? That periods of unrest and chaos are usually followed by a strongman sensing an opportunity, almost like a shark smelling blood in the water. And here's where we return to Napoleon the III. With great interest did he follow the happenings in his home country. With the toppling of his enemy Louis Philippe and the proclamation of the Second French Republic, he recognized an opportunity for himself. But this time, he decides to play the game differently. His previous attempts have taught him that waltzing into the country and attempting to take it by brute force only really worked for his emperor namesake. So he decides to play the long game, and he adapts to the situation. When all this chaos and revolution is happening, he doesn't start a coup like last time. No, he just puts his name on the ballot like every other political candidate. And this just shows what kind of person he is. His versatility of thought and action lets him try new methods and ways of achieving power. I mean, it's hard to imagine Tsar Nicholas II, Louis XIV, or George III standing up for election. They would see this as beneath them. But not so Napoleon III. Modern times, modern man. So, it seems about time we get into this new French Republic and subsequent election of 1848. But I just want to throw something out there before I do. There are many ways to look at history. Many forms of analysis, if you will. Okay, what exactly do I mean here? Well, let me tell you about some ways to look at history. One way you could look at it is the trends and forces theory. It says that, for example, the 19th century was the century of nationalism, and that regardless or despite any actions individuals may take, it was always going to be the century of nationalism. That the way society was moving ahead could only lend itself to nationalism. Or another example, the steppe people of Mongolia and similar places were always going to be a nomadic, horse-centered civilization, no matter who ruled at the time. Or that England and Japan, as island nations, were always going to be heavily maritime-based countries, as much as they may have wanted to be land powers. And that's just one of many ways to look at history. There is also the Marxist analysis of history, or the more sinister race determinist analysis of history. And then there is the great man theory. This one says that history unfolds the way it does by exceptional individuals leaving their mark on history. For example, do you get a fascist Italy without Benito Mussolini? Or a Protestant Reformation without Martin Luther? Or a Mongol Empire without Genghis Khan? And although this theory has become sort of out of fashion more recently, it's hard not to see its merits, particularly in this story, because for me personally, it's hard seeing the history of France going anywhere near the way it did without Napoleon the Third, being who he is at this exact time. So just keep these thoughts in mind as we now get into this new republic and election. So, the old king gets toppled and a second republic is proclaimed. At the head of this new state are people like Alphonse de Lamartine, Adolphe Thiers, and Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo, of course, being the famous author of works such as Hunchback of Notre Dame and Les Miserables, among others. Now, everything wasn't smooth sailing for these and other men of the new government. As we have mentioned previously, by the 1840s, the populace starts to warm up more and more to socialist causes. And the first weeks of the new republic see a lot of far-left and socialist agitators trying to steer the new government in their direction. This same government mostly rejects these attempts and cracks down hard on these groups, alienating them. And as this new Republican government quite obviously never had much monarchist or right-wing support, their popularity suffers from both sides accordingly. The lower class saw the new regime as the bourgeoisie middle class pandering to the rich and powerful, and the upper class saw the regime as the liberal middle class replacing the old ways and order. So it seems it would take both a man with lower and upper class support to unify the country. But where could such a man be found? What kind of person would be capable of enticing both the left and the right? Enter Napoleon the Third. Now, this new republic had just ratified a new constitution, written in part by Alexis de Tocqueville, in which the offices of the president were given a lot of power. So naturally, when the first presidential election rolled around, political hopefuls saw this as the big prize to be had. So Napoleon the Third was not the only one running for office. You had people like Alphonse de Lamartine trying to solidify his political position. Also running was a certain General Cavaignac, who had become infamous for cracking down on socialists. And talking about socialists, you also had a man named Alexandre Auguste Ledru-Rollin heading that camp. There were more candidates, of course, but those are the main ones we need to remember for now. And you know, I just can't help myself. I really want to compare this to the election of 2016 in the US. Now, I have no intention of being overly political here, or overtly political, but some of the similarities are striking. I mean, you have the middle to upper class establishment candidates like Cavaignac and Lamartine pretty much resembling Hillary Clinton. You have the socialist Ledru-Rollin pretty much resembling Bernie Sanders. And then you have, let's say, a different looking, different talking, remember Napoleon the Third had a strong accent, different candidate whose slogan could have just as easily been "Make France Great Again," resembling Donald Trump. And now that's not where the similarities between those two events end, but I will not dwell too long on this comparison. But if you are in the know about 2016 and all that happened there, having that in your mind while you listen on will be interesting, to say the least. Now, as we had talked about in the last part, Napoleon the Third had become famous for writing The Extinction of Pauperism. And the left wing of France loved him for that. He, of course, was also famous for his name and heritage and his statements calling for a strong French state, which endeared him to the right. And something interesting happens here. During this election campaign, the populace sort of grafts their political hopes onto Napoleon. You ask a socialist what he thinks of Napoleon, well, they might answer champion of workers' rights. But at the same time, you might ask a landed noble, and he might say champion of order, heritage, and French national values. So both sides kind of saw what they wanted in him, a mirror for your political wishes, so to speak. As the hard-fought campaign keeps rolling along, it was becoming clear that Napoleon the Third had started to amass quite the following. So eventually, the Conservative Party, headed by Adolphe Thiers and Victor Hugo, officially endorsed him, making the argument that he was the lesser of two evils, and that if he should win, and that is a big if, or so they thought, that they could easily control the blundering buffoon who had so famously botched two coups. They refer to him as a turkey who believes he's an eagle, and surely they could control a turkey. This seem reminiscent of something to you? Anyway, the political machine that is at this point Napoleon the Third keeps steaming along. And along the way, he keeps doing what he does best, securing large amounts of money for his campaign by having an affair with a rich lady named Harriet Howard. Classic Napoleon the Third. Well, that's not the only classic Napoleon the Third move he makes here. He ramps up his signature political strategy of appealing to both sides of the aisle. He proclaims that, quote, religion, family, property, the eternal basis of all social order. Which, is as conservative as you can get. But at the same time, he is also saying things like, quote, to give work to those unoccupied, to look out for the old age of the workers, to introduce in industrial laws those improvements which don't ruin the rich, but which bring about the well-being of each and the prosperity of all. This sounds like almost any socialist slogan of today, so this duality of his starts to really propel him forward in his election build. So, it was becoming clear that Napoleon the Third was gaining steam and potentially heading towards victory. The political establishment, though, had a trick up their sleeve. You see, the way the presidential election worked at the time was that if you got less than 50% of the total vote, then the National Assembly, pretty much the Senate or House of Representatives at the time, will be handed the vote. And guess who controlled the National Assembly? That's right, the political establishment, of course. And nobody thought Napoleon could win at least 50% in such a divisive political time. And you know what? They were right. Absolutely right. He didn't win 50% of the vote. Not even close. He won 74% of the vote. It was a landslide election. He left the other candidates in the dust. Not even Lamartine, the man pretty much behind the New Republic, could even come close. Around 5.5 million votes for Napoleon and around 17,000 for Lamartine. Only General Cavaignac came somewhat close, but not really close, with about 1.4 million votes. The socialist leader, Le Rollin, had about 300,000. And so, a Bonaparte was yet again France's head of government, if only president and not emperor for now. You know, when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany and started implementing his evil policies, a large amount of people were shocked initially. You see, they had heard all the speeches and such that he made, but they had assumed that all of his more extreme ideas were more rhetorical, and that when he promised to remove undesirables from Germany or fight Bolshevism to the end, well, they weren't exactly thinking of death camps or war with the UdSSR. Now, don't get me wrong here. A lot of people were thinking or hoping that even. But a lot of people, both inside and outside the country, assumed that a lot of these things were more political promises than an actual plan. Like when a politician today promises an end to inequality or an end to poverty or the like, you assume he's going to move in that direction, but you may not actually think that these goals will become manifest immediately. Or maybe think of it this way. Many companies today try to sell an image or a lifestyle instead of just a product. In a deodorant commercial, maybe they don't just show a man applying the product and then that's it. They show a man using the product and then being surrounded by women, becoming famous and all that stuff. An image, a lifestyle, not only a product. I don't know, this $500 shirt isn't just to keep you warm and covered, it's to show all your friends how cool and fashionable you are. So, long sidetrack aside, for me, in my opinion, a lot of people, especially the elite, saw Napoleon the Third and his whole image as just that, an image. He may have tried to grab power for himself twice. He may talk highly about absolute monarchies and the empire, or he might talk so much about his socialist ideals, but, that's all just talk, right? Rhetoric, something to get the masses fired up. A brand image, if you will. Napoleon TM. He wasn't actually going to effectuate any of that, right? Well, he is about to prove everyone wrong yet again. What's the first thing he does as president? He hangs a giant portrait of Napoleon the III in his office, and then he wears a uniform similar to that of his emperor uncle. Now, if that's not telling enough, then get ready for this. He actually changes the title of office he holds from president to prince president. Prince? President? I mean, come on. If you don't smell something fishy going on right about now, then I don't know what to say. Imagine that if one of your country's next president or chancellor or prime minister changes their title to maybe supreme chancellor or absolute president or anything like that. You and your country presumably would be up in arms, right? Well, in France at that time this may have angered some, even many, but any reaction to it was negligible. And this man is just getting started. His next action, and you gotta remember, he had just gotten elected, and his presidency or prince presidency had barely begun. While his next action is typical Napoleon the Third, playing both sides. In Italy, as a direct aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, a Republican force under famed revolutionary Garibaldi, a man who definitely deserves his own episode here, Well, he attacks the Papal States in order to help further the cause of a unified Italy. Now remember, Napoleon the Third had something for Italy. He had spent most of his formative years there. But also, he's at the same time a staunch Catholic, and he wishes the authority of the Catholic Church to be undisturbed. So without consent of his government, he orders his troops to defend the Pope and fight off the revolutionaries, while at the same time forcing the Pope to adopt a more liberal style of rule in the Papal States, playing both sides yet again. So, in the course of his first year in office, he pulls many similar stunts, such as these. Always playing both sides. He would one day strengthen the right and weaken the left, and next day he would strengthen the left and weaken the right, and so on and so on. Now, the masses and the people throughout this first year were mostly on his side, but the political establishment started to loathe him, at least those who did not loathe him from the start. And in 1849, with a National Assembly election removing almost all of his supporters in the government, Adolphe Thiers, who formally endorsed him leading the right wing, and Louis Rollin and another socialist named François-Vincent Raspail leading the left wing. And here again, Napoleon the Third pulls off one of his ideologically conflicting moves. In order to crack down on the left wing of his opposition, who had at this point declared him an illegitimate president and were gathering in the streets of Paris to potentially even overthrow him, he orders almost all of them arrested, exiles them, and closes down pretty much every left-wing club and newspaper. Although, while simultaneously advocating for the expansion of suffrage and the elimination of a lot of voter requirements, effectively countering his right-wing opposition at the same time whose power rests in part on voter suppression. Playing both sides, yet again. And it's here where we have to ask ourselves again, who is this Napoleon the Third? Throughout the show, I've been trying to answer this very question, because if he's an unrepentant monarchist, then why does he fight the right so much? And if he is a socialist or liberal in wolves or monarchical clothing, then why does he fight the left so often? So much of what he does seems odd or outright contradictory if you view him through the classical, cynical history view. The view that says that most actions and persons are calculated and serve some political or personal gain. But what if he just really believed in two or more things at once? If he really thought social conservatism, liberal economics, and top-down politics could work in harmony? Well, no matter the feasibility or the true motive of his ideas, his power to effectuate them was soon to be gone, as his time as democratically elected leader of France was drawing to a close. His 4-year term of office, which he had held for more than 3 years now, so 1848 to 1851, was about to end. He attempted to legally retain power by extending his term through constitutional change, but he was rebuffed. His enemies in the government checked his every move. He was now cornered with two paths ahead of him: retreat or advance. So as his uncle before him, he was about to make the next step in consolidating his rule, the next step in grabbing power, the next step to finally become emperor. A plan was hatched for a coup d'etat to permanently install Napoleon the Third as absolute ruler of France, emperor. or with the help of the French military, who firmly supported such a militaristic leader and a potential return to the glory days, when Napoleon used them to execute his plan on the 2nd of December, 1851. The 2nd of December, of course, being the anniversary of the Battle of Austerlitz, in which Napoleon the First had so famously established his hegemony over Europe. So on the night of the 2nd of December, soldiers occupied key positions in the city of Paris, where they arrested all who resisted, notably a lot of members of the National Assembly. The National Assembly was shortly afterwards dissolved. Napoleon the Third was now in control of Paris, and whoever controls Paris controls France. All power was now in the hands of the Prince President. And that's it. It was over, and not even a day. He had done it. This time, his plan had worked. No ridicule and failure this time. No one was laughing at him now. Destiny, coincidence, third time's the charm. Whatever your reasoning, against all odds, this young exile in Switzerland had turned into undisputed leader of France. Now, this coup did not go over completely smoothly. Actually, Victor Hugo, who has featured in the story before, started an impromptu insurrection against the coup, manning the barricades to fight for republicanism. An experience which no doubt provided ample inspiration for him to then go on to write his most famous book, Les Miserables, a book which he will write and publish in Belgium as his impromptu insurrection gets swiftly beaten down and he is forced into exile. So now, this is it. A Bonaparte is at the helm of France once again. Shortly after the coup of 1851, Napoleon the Third will crown himself emperor, much like his uncle did before him, and set his sight on the many tasks he seeks to accomplish in his reign. And oh, had he plans for France and his new empire. Now, don't think that this ascension to power and his subsequent plans for the nation were immediately welcomed by all. Yes, he had his immense popular support, plus his cadre of elites willing to do his bidding, but still many were skeptical, especially of his plans. Drouin de Louis, Napoleon the Third's foreign minister, said that the emperor has immense desires and limited abilities. He wants to do extraordinary things, but is only capable of extravagances. Well, so what are his extravagant plans, you ask? I'll let the man himself, Napoleon the Third, explain it. Although, before I read this quote, note that I have slightly edited this quote for better understanding. This is Napoleon the Third speaking. Quote, "Some say the empire is war. I say the empire is peace. Like Bonaparte the First, I have many conquests to make. Like him, I wish to draw into the stream of the great popular river those hostile side currents which lose themselves without profit to anyone. We have immense unplowed territories to cultivate, roads to open, ports to dig, rivers to be made navigable, canals to finish, a railway network to complete. We have, in front of Marseille, a vast kingdom to assimilate into France. We have all the great ports of the West to connect with the American continent by modern communications, which we still lack. We have ruins to repair, false gods to tear down, truths which need to make triumph. This is how I see the empire. These are the conquests I am considering, and you around me who, like me, want the good of our country, you are my soldiers. Quite the program, right? Well, that's not even the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what Napoleon the Third will do with his country. After the restoration of Bonaparte hegemony, France will embark on a journey to stake its claim in Africa, to modernize their country, fight for Italian independence, expand socialist and monarchist agenda, invade Mexico, rebuild Paris into the city we know today, and of course, ultimately face down its inevitable nemesis, Prussia, in a battle for life or death, which culminates in... Well, to find out more about what happens during Napoleon III's reign and how it spectacularly comes to an end, you will have to stay tuned for the next episode of The Historic Route.